let me go ahead and, of course, talk about the thing, of course, we'll get to today that's important overall. Of course, I'm going to talk about just like part one lecture today about the rise of the British Empire, which really starts around the time of like Queen Elizabeth, Henry VIII. So we'll kind of talk about the rise of the Stuart dynasty that takes over England. I'll talk about the Stuart dynasty a little bit too. They seize power, of course, in England. They're, of course, really a Scottish dynasty. So they'll take over and really create what we call Great Britain afterwards. So anyway, yeah, we're going to talk about the rise of the British Empire. The British Empire, if you know much about it, is one of the largest empires, of course, in history. It's, I think, considered the largest over like a couple others that are there. I know by the 1920s, the British Empire stretched to like somewhere between 13 to 14 million square miles at one point. If you want the kilometers or whatever, 35 million square kilometers. So a pretty large size empire overall. I'll kind of show you a map showing you, but at one point, the empire stretched to about, one fourth of the known Earth. I think I've got a map kind of showing you what it looked like at one point, but you can see the British Empire stretched, from Canada. You can see, of course, in North America. Of course, at one point they controlled part of North America, like all the way to the Mississippi River. You see. Also, Belize, parts of the Caribbean, part of South America, you can see was controlled by them, but most of their territories were predominantly in Africa. You can see parts of Asia, especially around India, Southeast Asia, of course, Australia, New Zealand, and even, of course, getting into like parts of the Pacific as well. New Zealand, you can see as well. So massive empire that they had at one point. I think under King George V, that was the peak of they think the British Empire overall. And this particular state, by the way, the United Kingdom, you know much about it today, like, itself as a country, is only makes up an area of like 93,600 square miles, which includes England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. But at one point, United Kingdom was part of this large British Empire, which broke up, later in the 20th century. Overall, they do have, I think later the United Kingdom is part of what they call the Commonwealth of Nations, which is, of course, a bunch of countries that are part of that from the remnants of the British Empire and all that. But looking at empires here, you can see how, the British Empire, there's other empires that were large too, just like that one. But you've got the Mongol Empire, which I think was the largest empire based on land. Because it didn't really go overseas, because parts of the British Empire are based overseas and not connected as one piece of land. Russian Empire at one point was also pretty large, third largest, of course, you can see overall. Now I'm going to get into today. Here's also this thing kind of giving you an idea too about the British Empire. Yeah, they think 1922. That might be the peak year, maybe, of the British Empire at one point. 458 million people at one point had lived under the British Empire, just to kind of give you an idea, of course, of that. Now, I'm going to get into today, I'm going to talk about the Tudor dynasty, because that's the dynasty they think that really the British Empire kind of starts to rise up, maybe at the end of it. And the empire kind of, really, the Tudor dynasty is really the dynasty that really is the first major one into the early modern era of English history. The Kingdom of England reigns from about 1485 to 1603. You can see there. So they kind of come in at the end of the Middle Ages into like the early 17th century. Then you have the Stuart dynasty I'll get to later that reigns from like the 17th century to the 18th century that you have. I think I've got kind of some pictures here. I think of the, where is it exactly? I thought I had showing the whole family tree of the whole Tudor family, which is right here. The Tudors are related to this king you see at the top left. who is King Henry VII, who they also call Henry Tudor as well. He came to power at the end of what they call the War of Roses. War of the Roses was the civil war in England that broke out in the late 16th century, late 15th century, 1455 to 1485. And it was the civil war between these two royal families that were part of the Plantagenet dynasty. They had one called the Lancaster family and one called the York family. They call it the War of the Roses because supposedly in their coat of arms, the Lancasters had a red rose and the Yorks had a white rose. And so that's hence why they called it that name. But anyway, Henry eventually seized power at the end of the War of Roses. Then he married Elizabeth of York, who was a York, and Henry was from the Lancaster side. So the two families kind of intermarried afterwards. And so that's kind of what, started the whole Tudor dynasty that would take over, of course, afterwards. Of course, you can see all the different, we got a lot of the different monarchs that are listed there, but I'll put them on the screen for you so you can kind of see all of them. But these are all the Tudor monarchs, like the main ones that were, of course, official rulers that they had. Henry VII, of course, you can see reigned from 1485 to 1509. Henry VIII, 1509 to 47. Edward VI, who was the son of Henry VIII, reigned from 1547 to 1553. Mary the First, or Queen Mary the First, 1553 to 58. And then you also had Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603. I think there's also Lady Jane Grey they kind of include in there too sometimes, but she was never coronated as the actual ruler, and so sometimes she's not seen as an official one that actually reigned. You can also see all of the wives of Henry VIII, of course, very famous. The six wives of Henry VIII. We'll kind of talk about that later. And of course, you can also see the children, of course, at least of the first three wives, because he didn't really have any children with his the second set. Anne of Cleves, Catherine of Howard, Catherine Parr, they were all childless, of course, later. Now, of course, we'll talk about King Henry VIII the most, and then, of course, I'll probably get later to talking about Queen Elizabeth. But Henry VIII, as we've talked about him before, was famous for starting the English Reformation, which would occur in England really starting in the 1530s, and it would go up to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. This was a time in England where, if you know what happened, eventually their religion goes from being Catholic to being a Protestant type church. Of course, it's called different names: Anglican Church, Church of England. Anglicanism is also used too, as well, to describe the actual faith as well, which spread, worldwide and all that. But I think we had talked about before the fact that what caused the whole thing was the fact that Henry VIII wanted to annul his first marriage, which was to Catherine of Aragon, who was the one at the top left there of those six wives of Henry VIII. I think usually her name is spelled with a K because that's the Spanish variation of it. And Catherine of Aragon, if you know about her, was a Spanish princess. She was the daughter of Ferdinand Isabella of Spain. And she had actually originally married Henry VIII's brother, Arthur, who had died young. And then she married basically Henry, which is kind of weird. But they lacked a male heir. I think I'll get to it later, but the only daughter that really survives that's really legitimate, that can, be a ruler later is, Queen Mary, Mary the First, who, of course, they later call her Bloody Mary in England, as you know, and all the other heirs. I think he had some male heirs that had I think may have lived at one point, but they died young. He did have an illegitimate son named Henry Fitzroy that he recognized, but he couldn't officially get the throne, of course, and all that. So that's what basically leads to Henry creating the English Reformation at that point. And he did that through acts of parliament. That's something you have to understand, the way it was done, of course. King Henry, most of these were done by several acts. That's the one that they talk about, I guess, usually the most is the Act of Supremacy, which Parliament issued in 1534. That basically made the monarch the head of the church and the state. The supreme head was the original title, of course, which I think the current one that Queen Elizabeth II uses is supreme governor now, which I think was later switched under Queen Elizabeth I. So after that, Henry began, taking control of all the church lands. He closed down the monasteries and the convents, and he also forced all of the clergy to take an oath to this new church, Church of England. There were some that wouldn't do it. You know about the story about this. Sir Thomas More, who was one of Henry's high chancellors, refused to, take an oath to it. He was put to death for it. I think he's later a martyr in the Catholic Church, of course, now. Anglicanism, at least under Henry, was not really a Protestant church, not yet. It was like this quasi-Catholic church that was led by him, which I think they call it sometimes Henrician Catholicism, you see below. It's not really until his son Edward comes in that you really start seeing the church going more towards being basically Protestant. They do have like clerical officials that are under it. The archbishops of Canterbury and also the Archbishop of York, those are the two highest religious leaders that are under the Church of England, of course. And so they're pretty important. And these are leftover bishops, from archbishops from basically the Catholic Church that were there. Now, of course, what would happen, as you know, Henry would eventually, remarry. Of course, go to this, pictures of the different wives of Henry VIII. Of course, there's a kind of a famous Henry VIII rhyme you may have heard about the different wives and how they're associated with, well, I guess what happened to them or whatever. But saying is, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. You do that real fast. Of course, kind of a tongue twister. But obviously, we'll talk about all 6 wives and what they're kind of famous for and all that. Yeah, his second wife is Anne Boleyn. You see at the top in the middle there. She was actually, I think one of her sisters was actually a mistress to actually Henry VIII at one point, and she was actually a maid of honor that was under Catherine of Aragon prior to this. And I guess Henry felt smitten with her and eventually married her. However, he was disappointed in the fact that he was only able to give really one daughter, like a daughter to Henry VIII, no son. That got legitimate heir, male heir. And so he had like trumped up charges put on her for high treason, and she was later executed, of course, in 1536. At the same time, he had this other woman that he fell in love with also, which is Jane Seymour at the top right. She was actually a maid of honor for Anne Boleyn. And I think he was actually courting her as he was trying to dump Anne Boleyn at the same time. And that was Jane Seymour is actually Henry VIII's favorite wife. Now, the 6 wives they liked the most. And so after Anne Boleyn was beheaded, he married Jane Seymour, but she died from childbirth complications when she gave birth to Edward VI, of course, who would later be his only legitimate male son but basically within really 4 years, he was out of 3 wives at that point. They also had, of course, the bottom left there. They had another woman who was actually German. Her real name was Anne von Cleve. Of course, they call her in England Anne of Cleves. And she was this German princess that Henry VIII married for political reasons. But for some reason, he didn't like her, I guess they never consummated the marriage and wasn't really smitten with her. And so he later had that annulled or divorced afterwards. But she later outlived it. I think only 2 of the wives outlived really Henry VIII, Anne of Cleves, and I think later Catherine Parr. The one on the bottom in the middle is Catherine Howard. She was a teenager when she married Henry VIII, who was much older at the time. And however, the marriage didn't last long, like a year or so, because they found out that apparently she had committed adultery with one of Henry VIII's like friends. A man named Thomas Culpeper, who was part of Henry's court. They found letters, I think they were writing to each other. And so they were found out and both were executed for it in 1542. So he was out of number fifth wife at that point. And then finally, the last wife that he married, on the bottom right there, you see Catherine Parr. She was this divorcee who had been married twice before. And he had been married 5 times before. So they were perfect together, that kind of thing. So that was his last wife. But the last 3 never had any children after that, of course, no children. And so I think, yeah, she outlived him too, by the way, because he died in 1547 and all that. So that's basically, the story about the 6 wives of Henry VIII, of course, which, is quite a soap opera, if you study about Henry VIII. There's been a lot of books, of course, written about that overall. Now, what happened was Henry, like I said, died January 1547. And so the throne went to King, Edward VI came in, which, of course, is his only legitimate son that I told you about. And he reigned for about 6 years, 1547 to 1553. I think he was around maybe 10 when he came to the throne. And he died young. He was 16 when he died, which he had health issues, which I think was from tuberculosis, which he suffered from in those days. But the important thing about, Edward VI is that he was really considered to be the first Protestant ruler of England, because it's really under him that the country starts going, of course, more towards being Protestant, the Anglican Church. I'll get to Lady Jane Grey. She's controversial. Well, that's her cousin he tries to put on the throne. But I did want to mention about this man here, which is Thomas Cranmer, who is, by the way, the Archbishop of Canterbury, you see right there. And he's important because he's really the man that really wrote or edited or developed the so-called Book of Common Prayer, which really becomes the main prayer book that's used by the Anglican Church. It's also used by a lot of other type of, Anglican or Episcopalian type churches worldwide. And I think he's one that also helped, Henry get all these different wives he married, like divorced women and all that stuff under him. And but yeah, he's kind of important for that. And it's really under him that they think Calvinism starts coming in the country. And so a lot of the Calvinistic ideology, 39 articles, which is the main doctrines of the Anglican Church, all that's kind of developed, of course, at the time around Henry VIII and Edward VI overall. Now, the only thing, though, was Edward died young, like I said. He was like 16 when he died. And he had this cousin that he had, first cousin, that was named Lady Jane Grey, that he tried to put on the throne because she was, Protestant. And he didn't really want to give the throne to Mary. He was his half-sister who was Catholic. And so for about 9 days, if you know about her, she was actually the ruler in the country, although she was never really coronated and all that as the actual queen. And what happened was, we'll get to it later, Mary eventually seizes power, overthrows her, throws her in the Tower of London at one point, and eventually will have her later executed in 1554. And so that's why Lady Jane Grey is later known as the so-called 9 Days Queen. Of course, kind of a nickname we have. So I guess briefly, she's kind of considered like, a Tudor, but wasn't really official monarch, at least. I guess after she's coordinated or whatever. So yeah, Queen Mary, you see on the left there, that's kind of a famous painting of her. She comes in, she reigns for around 5 years, 1553 to 1558. She's not exactly a popular ruler. Of course, very unpopular. I'll get to it later, but she was known for a lot of persecutions against Protestants. And she does have the nickname Bloody Mary because of her persecution of Protestants. People think of like the drink Bloody Mary, which I guess evolved from that later on, but she didn't invent the drink, if you're wondering about that, but I guess it's kind of named after her now today. But yeah, she is controversial. A lot of it is because of the fact that when she took over England, she started this counter Reformation to make the country Catholic again. She wanted to reconvert it after Henry and Edward had started converting it, I guess, towards Protestantism and all that. And so that led to the so-called Marian persecutions, where a lot of people were executed under her, which not quite about 300, but I think 284 Protestants at one point were actually executed under her, which included, by the way, being burned at the stake, because Thomas Cranmer, who she basically sacked as Archbishop of Canterbury and all that, closed down the Anglican Church, had him burned at the stake in 1556. So he was actually killed and all that. And so, yeah, that's what got her the name Bloody Mary. So still, she's not very popular today in England. I think it's one of the most unpopular monarchs they ever had. Of course, there's Bloody Mary on the right, but on the left is her husband that she ends up marrying, who, of course, you know about him. That is Prince Philip of Spain, who was the son of Emperor Charles V. We've talked about before, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain. That was a very controversial marriage that would happen, I think, in 1554. And so this marriage actually would spark a rebellion in the country where some of the Englishmen decided to rebel and try to overthrow her reign, which occurred, they think, in the winter of 1554, January, February of that year. Actually happened all over England, although I think the hotbed of it was apparently in the southeastern part of England, especially around where Kent is. And here's kind of a map showing you the plot, I guess, to try to overthrow Mary, which happened. The man on the right you see, of course, in that picture is a man named Sir Thomas Wyatt. He was the main leader of this plot to overthrow her. They think there were other Englishmen involved that later were executed for it. They were hoping to overthrow Mary and maybe put Lady Jane Grey back on the throne, or I think there was even theories that they might try to put Elizabeth on the throne, the half-sister of Mary, because Lady Jane Grey was in the Tower of London and all that. And I think Elizabeth was later put in the Tower of London at one point as well. And his forces, I think, which numbered, I think, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men, one point marched on London and got very close to where the London Bridge is. But troops under Mary's forces basically were able to crush the rebellion, and Wyatt was later executed for it. But obviously she was unpopular. People did not like, of course, Bloody Mary. And eventually she died young, if you know about this. It's kind of a strange story about this, but throughout her reign, she thought she was pregnant. There's all this impending doom, I guess, in England that she was getting ready to give birth to a boy or girl, whatever it was, some kind of heir. But it was actually cancer in her uterus, uterine cancer. They call it the so-called phantom pregnancy of Mary the First and all that. But luckily she got cancer and died, and so they didn't have to worry about having a Catholic ruler on the throne. But Philip will later try to take it, if you know about that, with the so-called Spanish Armada invasion in 1588. He'll try to come back and try to get it and all that, but that'll fail overall. All right, let me move on next, of course, to talk about the most famous of the Tudor monarchs, of course, which is Elizabeth I. As you know, the half-sister of Mary and Edward that comes in. Elizabeth, known as the so-called Virgin Queen. Very, very famous. She reigned from 1558 to 1603. They consider that to be the so-called Golden Age of England. You may have heard that nickname before. A lot of you refer to it as being called the Elizabethan era. Because of her influence on England and the world. Also, they call it the Shakespearean era as well, because the fact that William Shakespeare wrote a lot of his plays, especially at the end of her reign, and then later under King James's reign that came later. She does have other nicknames. She was called Virgin Queen because she never married. She never took a consort, a male consort that she married. They do think she remained a virgin throughout her reign, or her life, really. It's been speculated about. She may have had lovers, but that's never really been proven, about Queen Elizabeth. But they do think, she was a great ruler. She had other nicknames, by the way. Good Queen Bess is a kind of another nickname they sometimes called her, although she could be bad too. She had a lot of people executed under her reign, including her cousin, if you know about this, Mary, Queen of Scots. And Gloriana, I think, is another name she was also known for as well. But her reign, she's the last Tudor monarch. Of course, she doesn't have any children. So what's going to end up happening later, the throne, the British throne is going to end up going to, of course, the Stuarts later, which I'll talk about. But she is considered to be one of the greatest monarchs in British history. Definitely up there. I think Henry VIII and her are considered the two greatest Tudor monarchs overall. But I think a lot of British historians think she was one of the greatest. Fourth longest, which you can see she reigned about roughly, I guess, about 44, 45 years was how long she was, of course, on the throne. Now, I'll kind of get into talking about some things about her reign, which are kind of important, of course. The most important thing that she had that occurred during her reign was the Elizabethan religious settlement. This was a series of reforms that were done by Parliament to restore the Anglican Church, which, her half-sister Mary had closed down because they brought back the Catholic faith to England. So they made all these reforms to it. It also helped to end the English Reformation, which had been going on since the 1530s, going back to the time of King Henry VIII. So period of around 50-something years that the English Reformation was kind of going on. And this church itself was heavily influenced by Calvinism. That's one thing you have to understand. It is a Protestant type church. It does have Catholic influences in it, which is true. Because if you know about the Anglican Church, they kept the clergy, which they call the episcopacy. So you've got, basically bishops and priests and things like that that are in it. They kept now one thing they didn't do, Latin was gotten rid of. In England, they were starting to go to English sermons, English Bibles and things like that. And so everything was done in English afterwards. Bibles were starting to be produced because I know under King Henry VIII, they had the Great Bible of Henry VIII that came out in the 1530s. So you start getting English Bibles being produced. Book of Common Prayer, of course, in English also as well, which was brought back. And then also another thing that's interesting about a lot of the Anglican Church and Protestant churches, they allow clerical marriage, where priests, of course, can marry and things like that, because that was heavily influenced by Martin Luther and John Calvin and all these others, I guess, that married, etc. They did have this thing called the Act of Uniformity that came out, which reestablished the Book of Common Prayer as the main prayer book of the Anglican Church. So basically that became the standard prayer book pretty much since then afterwards. Also forced English, the English to attend church. So you had the attend church, you had the tithe it and things like that. There was no religious freedom for other, types of religious sects, things like that. And so it was like a state church that everybody had to go to, things like that. I've got some slides here showing some things they had right here. But yeah, if you didn't go to church, you might have to pay a fine. Or I think there's even a case where some people were in prison if they didn't go to church and things like that. And so it does combine some Catholic with some Protestant stuff, because they got these bishops and things like that you see in a Catholic church and things like that overall. And they have the icon, a lot of the crosses and things like that still being used, of course, in this type of church that they have. And so Anglican Church is a pretty large church worldwide. I told you before, billions of people, of course, are in this church worldwide. Now in the United States, we call it the Episcopalian Church usually, of course. Now I'm going to also, there, of course, is just different churches that are out there. Canterbury Cathedral, of course, considered one of the most famous of the different churches that are associated with the Anglican Church. That's the seat, of course, of the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's there. You may have heard of Westminster Abbey. That's a very famous church that was built in the Middle Ages. Collegiate Church of St. Peter at Westminster, sometimes it's called. And that's an important church because that's where a lot of the monarchs of the British have been crowned or coronated, which I think going all the way back to the time of William the Conqueror. Also, a lot of them get married there too. Well, been a lot of royal marriages that occurred, including I think Prince William got married there a few years ago. Now, I did want to talk about Mary, Queen of Scots. She's an important woman. She, of course, if you know about her, was the closest heir to Elizabeth, to the British throne. And she was the actual monarch of Scotland for about 20 years, from 1547 to 1567. And she was actually married. She was related through one of Henry VIII's sisters, which was Margaret Tudor, who had married into the Stuart dynasty in Scotland and all that. She was very controversial because of the fact that at the time, if you study about Scotland, they were going from being Catholic to being Presbyterian or Protestant. And so they had this Catholic ruler that was on the throne and all that. So that was kind of an issue that they had. But they had other things that was kind of a controversy about her as well, which is her numerous marriages that she had. At one point, she was actually married to the King of France, France II, but he died like real young. So she came back to Scotland from France. And then she married this cousin of hers, I think it was a first cousin named Lord Darnley, who was known as Henry Stuart. And apparently, Lord Darnley and her didn't get along. He was a drunk. I think he abused her. And there was a case where they think Mary Stuart may have had other lovers. I think it was a man named David Rizzio, who I think was advisor to her. And he actually had him murdered, basically. And then there was this other man you see on the bottom, who's the Earl of Bothwell, known as James Hepburn. He kind of felt sorry for Mary Stuart. I think he was her lover too, as well. They think he may have plotted to kill her second husband, Lord Darnley, and murder. Sounds like a soap opera, all this. I think there's even some speculation that Mary may have been somehow implicated in the whole thing, to kill off her second husband and all that. But later she was put under house arrest by the Scots, but she was able to escape. And so you get, you got the Scottish Reformation going on in Scotland at the time, and so she's forced basically to leave the country at that point. So what happened later? Mary Stuart fled the country. She went to England. She thought her first cousin Elizabeth would help her get her throne back in Scotland, but they didn't want to put her back on the throne because England was going Protestant, just like Scotland was at that point. And so what Elizabeth did was she basically put her in prison, like in various castles around England, and the two never met, which is kind of weird about Elizabeth and, of course, Mary, Queen of Scots, and all that. There's a story where supposedly in 1587 there was this plot that they think Mary was kind of involved in to try and see if she could kill off Elizabeth and overthrow her reign. It was called the Babington plot. And it was found out by a lot of spy masters that were under Elizabeth's reign. Because I think under him, a lot of the English Secret Service kind of started at that point, or British Secret Service, as they call it later. And so she was arrested and accused of high treason of trying to kill Elizabeth, and she was later executed for it in 1587. So that basically, she actually had to kill off her own cousin. That was, of course, the heir to the throne and all that. Of course, later you'll see what's going to end up happening. I'll kind of blow this up here, but Mary, Queen of Scots, of course, had this son she had, King James, who took over, of course, Scotland after she was forced to flee. And so he's going to be very important. James is going to eventually end up being, of course, the ruler of England and Scotland, and what we call the first king of Great Britain, which will be in 1603. So we'll talk about him later and all that. Now, I did want to get into and talk about also one thing that's real famous, of course, about Elizabeth's reign is the so-called all the different they had these so-called Anglo-Spanish conflicts that broke out during her reign, which there was an undeclared war that occurred between England and Spain between 1485 to 1604. And both were kind of fighting for supremacy of, the Atlantic Ocean, parts of Western Europe at that time. And so they had these so-called sea dogs you may have heard of that were real famous under Elizabeth, which were basically these privateers that were hired by the crown to go after basically Spanish shipping. And these men were like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, and then if you look there on the right in that picture, that's Sir John Hawkins, you see there, who was later considered one of the top, really the head of the whole English Navy, which had originally been founded under Henry VIII. And so they got a lot of fame at that time because of that, and got very wealthy as well, because the English began preying off of the Spanish galleons that were bringing up all these riches from the New World, which as you know, the Spanish were plundering that from all those indigenous peoples like the Incas and the Aztecs. Here's, of course, here's another kind of a picture showing all the different famous sea dogs that were, of course, well known that you can see there. I think Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh were half brothers of each other. They were kind of related to each other. But the one that's the most famous is Sir Francis Drake. He's really considered to be the one that you've probably heard of the most that's well known. Drake was very, very famous for his circumnavigation of the world, which he did between 1577 to 1580. Really the first really successful one, because if you remember correctly, Magellan had died halfway around the world. This was part of a planned expedition to not only attack, obviously, the Spanish shipping in the Atlantic and also in the Pacific, but also to discover more about the world as a whole. And so his expedition, which took place in, I think, a little less than 3 year period between 1577 to 1580, kind of show a map showing this right here. But there's Drake's Golden Hind, which is famous, which was his famous, I guess, his flagship that he used, which was a type of English galleon ship that he went around the world. And that's a replica of it. But here's kind of the route that he took. But you can see he kind of sailed down to the bottom of South America, just like Magellan did in the early part of the 16th century, and then sailed into the Pacific Ocean. I believe Drake was the one that found the Cape Horn, which is on the bottom of South America. He did sail all the way up to California at one point, believe it or not, which the British claimed at one point, and then sailed across the Pacific Ocean and then into the Indian Ocean as well. So the British find out more about the world after that. They're going to be able to use that to kind of decide where they're going to colonize and all that. Drake, by the way, had a nickname. He was often called the Dragon or the English Dragon. I think the British sometimes, I think the Spanish called him the El Drake, kind of a play off the word dragon or something like that. Anyway, now I'm going to move on. I want to talk about one more thing too under the Tudor dynasty. It's real famous. You have also the defeat of the Spanish Armada, which also occurred in 1588. And this is really considered the peak event that really happened under really, Elizabeth's reign. And the attack of the Spanish Armada happened the summer of 1588, July to August. And what happened was under King Philip II, he attempted this invasion of England to try to reconvert it to being Catholic, because Philip II, you know about it, was a big proponent of the Counter-Reformation to try to reconvert areas that are Protestant back to being Catholic and all this. And Philip built this huge armada, which had about 130 ships in it. And I believe the amount of men that were involved in it, I think they had a bunch of huge fleet with also a force of about, I want to say about 10, no, 30,000 troops that were going to ferry across. And it was actually the actual fleet. You can kind of show a map here of the actual fleet as it sailed through the English Channel, which is right here. They were actually going to land on the southern coast of England and march and take London at that point. And then I guess Philip was going to try to seize the throne and then convert all of England to being Catholic at that point. You can see the route that the Spanish Armada took. And it was led by this Spanish nobleman named Alonso Perez, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. You can see there on the left. And you can see Philip, of course, II on the right. They really thought it was invincible because the Spanish at the time had the greatest naval force in the world overall. But they seemed to think that the smaller English Navy had an advantage. They were more maneuverable, they were more faster, and then bad weather kind of played a role in why they think the Spanish ended up being defeated. And I guess it happened to be that the wind was blowing in the right direction and all that. And so I think the most famous battle they talk about is the Battle of Gravelines that happened on August 8th, 1588, close to where Flanders is and all that. And so from there, what happened was the Spanish fleet got pushed into the North Sea, and they end up losing like half their fleet, trying to actually get back to Spain. Because you can see kind of a route here, how the Spanish fleet had to go around Scotland, Ireland to get back. And some of the ships even landed, I think, on the northern coast of Scotland. They got captured or killed, or the men. The defeat of the Spanish Armada, by the way, was a turning point in European history. They always talk about that because they think that England will start to become a major power afterwards. I think 1588 is maybe considered to be the year maybe when the British Empire kind of really starts after that, because what's going to happen is the English are going to start colonizing different parts of the world, which they had tried before under Elizabeth, but had been a failure at that point. Spanish Empire, they think, starts to decline too. If you go, into the 17th century and all that, they start kind of going down. They do think 1588 was the peak of her success as a monarch. If you know about Elizabeth, she had this famous speech that she gave called the speech, The Troops at Tilbury, which was heard on the date of August 19th, 1588. They were kind of very, apprehensive about being invaded at that point. And she gets up there and gives this great speech talking about how, maybe she's not this, strong person like, a king should be, but she has the stomach of a king and the king of England. She was. So she has the heart and stomach, of a king and all that. But that was really her peak, of her reign of 1588. After that, she was in decline of the next few years. Of course, conflicts over, who was going to take over her throne. But everybody knew it was going to go to James, was all that. But yeah, how did she die? If you know about her, she died when she was about 69. She was almost 70 years old. They never did a post-mortem on her, so like an autopsy to find out what really killed her. But they do know that Elizabeth used a lot of makeup in those days, which had a lot of lead, mercury in it, and they think that had a lot to do with maybe causing cancer or something like that, or maybe she had a stroke later. They're not really sure about what exactly killed her, but obviously old age was one thing that really killed her in the end. But yeah, obviously, what would happen, of course, with her reign is that the big thing will happen, is King James is going to take over. We'll get to that later. The other thing that happened, of course, under her reign, of course, is you've got the period of William Shakespeare, Shakespearean era that occurs under Elizabeth, which at the end of her reign, and then also under King James's reign as well. So a lot of the great, plays of William Shakespeare occur under her overall. Shakespeare, by the way, is considered to be the greatest playwright in any language, period. Overall, he's I think published more works than probably any person. Like, I think his work has been published, I don't know how many times, millions of books have been made, of course. And they often call him the Bard of Avon because he was born, if you know about this, Stratford upon Avon is where he's from in England. And you know about Shakespeare, he's very famous for producing a lot of plays. We've kind of blow this up here for Romeo and Juliet, Merchant of Venice, Julius Caesar, Midsummer's Night's Dream, Henry IV, Henry V, Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night, Hamlet, and others. So at least close to about 38 plays were produced by him. 154 sonnets. He wrote a lot of plays, which of course has been a debate about who the plays were written for. Some people think they were plays written for a man, which is kind of weird. But yeah, he's of course great playwright, great of course also poet as well. Of course, he had his own theater as well, which was called the Globe Theater. There were actually two of them. He, of course, founded in 1599, of course, and it lasted about 1613. But the first Globe Theater burned down, if you know about that. Then he reopened a second one, which was around from 1614 to 1642. But the Puritans came to the country and they basically closed it down because they thought some of his plays were not up to Puritan religion and things like that. I'll talk about the Puritans later and all that. But a lot of his plays have been, reworked, redone over the years. And of course, a lot of them have been also made into a lot of movies as well. They do have this new, there's been a lot of different, theaters that have been mock versions of it, but the most famous one they have in London now is called the Shakespeare's Globe. Which I think was built in the 1990s. And so it's a kind of a replica, of course, of what they think the Globe Theater looked like. Because the Globe Theater was actually, I think after they closed it down the second time, it was demolished. So the original one doesn't exist anymore, but there's a lot of models out there or prototype versions of it, I guess, that are still around. I'm going to move on the next to talk about the Stuart dynasty as well. The Stuarts, of course, come in next and take over. You can see this particular dynasty ranged from 1603 to 1714. They come in, of course, after Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603. You can see there's like 7 monarchs that were, of course, part of it. James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II, William III, Mary II, and, of course, Queen Anne. Of course, William and Mary, of course, in the middle there. See on the bottom, I'll get to them later as a whole. The Stuarts were a Scottish dynasty. They go back to Scotland originally. But the first ruler that comes from Scotland that takes over England, of course, is King James I, who, by the way, had been ruling over Scotland going back to 1567. Believe it or not, he reigned 57 years, by the way, as the King of Scotland. That's a pretty long time as a ruler. Overall. And then from 1603 to 1625, he reigned as the King of Scotland and Ireland and also England. So all three of those were kind of reigned at the same time. But they do view James as being really the first ruler of what we call the United Kingdom of Great Britain, or UK for short later, of course, as they called it, which the name I think is a term he started using, the term Great Britain. But it wasn't officially used till really more into the 18th century overall. He did have a wife, Anne of Denmark, who I think that marriage kind of suffered badly, I know, between them. They didn't get along, but he did have 2 children that are kind of important later. King Charles I, of course, his main son and heir that he had. He also had Elizabeth Stuart, who's kind of be important later. She'll kind of married into some German families in Europe. And she'll be kind of a link later to the Hanover dynasty that you have, because some of the Hanovers are kind of related back through her in all that. There, of course, image of King James, who you see there, who's usually called King James VI of Scotland, and then King James I of England and Ireland as well. So you can see he's the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, like we said. Those are some of the major events that happened under his reign. So I'll talk about the gunpowder plot, 1605, just kind of famous a little bit. I'll talk about his colonization because that's one thing that's very famous. That's important because that leads into the British Empire later, of course. And also, I'll talk about, also don't have it in there, but he's wanted to develop the King James Bible or version of the Bible. That's also well known as well. Now, one of the most famous events that happened under his reign, of course, is the gunpowder plot, which happened, they think, in November of 1605 when it occurred. In fact, the members that were involved were arrested on November 5th, if you know about that, 1605. And they think this was a Catholic conspiracy. Some people call it a Jesuit conspiracy, where the Jesuits may have somehow been involved in a plot to assassinate James and put his daughter on the throne, which is Elizabeth Stuart. And so it involved several men that were Catholics that wanted to try to basically, I guess, reconvert England back to being Catholic again and all that. But what happened, luckily, was that the plot was uncovered by Robert Cecil. Robert Cecil was the son of William Cecil, who was one of the chief advisors of Henry VIII and also Elizabeth. Anyway, Robert Cecil uncovered it, and a lot of the conspirators were arrested, including Guy Fawkes, I think was one of the main ones you've probably heard about that was involved in it. And what they tried to do, if you know about this, was they tried to use gunpowder barrels to basically blow up Parliament, because I think they were going to blow up King James when he came to give a speech in the House of Lords. Guy Fawkes was there guarding the gunpowder when they basically arrested him and all that. And so that's why sometimes they call it Guy Fawkes Day, I think is a common name. I think they call it, or sometimes call it Bonfire Night, I think is another name they dub it. So it became this annual celebration that they have in the United Kingdom, that they have November 5th every year, where they shoot fireworks and they burn effigies of Guy Fawkes and things like that. But actually, there was another man named Robert Catesby, who I think was actually the man that was the main conspirator behind it. But he was killed, I think, in a gun battle. So that's kind of a famous story. And I think they made movies about it and all that. Of course, the other thing that James is also known for, he's very famous for starting the first to colonize. I mean, he colonized different parts of the world under him. Jamestown, which I'll get to a little later, 1607. Northern Ireland is colonized by him too, which I know the Irish aren't too happy about, of course. So originally called the Plantation of Ulster originally. And he did colonize Bermuda in 1609 as well, in the Central Atlantic, Northern Atlantic also. But yeah, let me first talk about the Plantation of Ulster. That was something he did in the early 1600s. So in Northern Ireland, you see around Ulster, they began to colonize that with mostly people from Scotland and also parts of Northern England. So you get all these Scotch Irish that kind of go over there and live in Northern Ireland. And as you know, it was controversial. I mean, part of why they went over there was to grow crops. It was because, got the name Plantation of Ulster with that. But it is controversial because of the fact that the English went over there and they began to try to convert the Irish to being Protestant because, they're Catholic and all that. And then they also tried to force the English language on them. And so that's created a lot of conflicts later, which go up to, the 20th century, as you know. They've had a lot of conflicts between the Irish and Northern Ireland, like the Irish Republican Army and all that you have back in the 20th century. But that area is still controlled by the British, and all that. And so that is kind of controversial today. So it's kind of talking about that. And you can see all the different Scots that, of course, migrated there to Northern Ireland, in Ulster area, of course, and basically they're called Scotch Irish. And they use that term, I think, also in America as well when they, I guess, went to the United States, some of them that migrate later. Of course, the other thing that King James is also known for, as you know, he would end up colonizing, of course, what we call Jamestown, the Jamestown colony, which you heard of, which is really the first American colony that's established in the New World. It was created by this uh, joint stock company that's called different names. Either the Virginia Company is the common name it's called, or Virginia Company of London as well. They call it London Company for short, usually. But the English wanted to try to colonize part of North America because they were hoping to capitalize on what the Spanish were doing in the New World. Because Spanish, they were finding all this gold and silver in the New World. So that's the primary reason for that. I guess that and to destabilize the Spanish Empire, et cetera. And so basically, the first settlers went there in 1607. And the early colony, which was founded in eastern Virginia, suffered. It was built, of course, on the James River, eastern Virginia. And but eventually, the Jamestown colony will be important because it will be basically the colony that will eventually give the English a foothold in what is Virginia. Also later the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts that you have. That'll be the prototype colonies that'll develop into the 13 American colonies that of course, British will have later, which they lose, after the American Revolution. But that's just kind of an aerial view of the actual location. But I know that the Jamestown colony struggled for many years and all that before it took off. But I think because of tobacco, that was the reason for why the colony eventually was successful. Of course, King James was also known for developing the King James Version of the Bible, which was published in 1611. There were English Bibles, before that, like the Great Bible of King Henry VIII, which I think came out in 1539. But this is kind of considered the most famous English Bible I think that was ever produced in the world. And it was actually developed from English translations or Old English translations of Greek and Hebrew texts that went back to the Old and New Testaments, which was done by the Anglican Church. And it is known for its Old English use of like thee, thou, and thy, and if you've ever read it and all that. But it is one of the most widely read Bibles in the world. I've got one in my, of course, library as well. Now, I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about the next thing we'll get to. Of course, I'm going to get to talking about the English Civil War today. We'll get that kind of for a few minutes on that. Not much time on that, but I'll kind of talk about that today, which is, of course, a major event that happens also in British history in the 17th century. You do get King Charles I that comes in. What happened was the end of James's reign declined due to the fact that James had an illness. He was kind of very ill. And so this man named George Villiers ran his actual throne, the Duke of Buckingham, he was called. And there were rumors about James. I haven't even heard the story about this before, but there were rumors that James was bisexual. I don't know if you know about this, but he liked women and men. And there was a rumor that him and the Duke of Buckingham were lovers. Because there used to be a joke about James that when Queen Elizabeth was king, and now James is king. It was the queen now, I guess, and not a king. But anyway, they kind of compared the two, and they thought that James was a weaker ruler, compared to Elizabeth. But some people knew that he was bisexual and stuff like that. But anyway, but he was the regent to Charles I. He was kind of too young when he came in, but he would actually come in. And the thing about James's son Charles, he would end up starting the English Civil War in the 1640s. A little about him, he is controversial. The one thing about the Stuarts, they had this link, back to Scotland that was influenced by the the French, who were, absolutists or believed in divine right and all that. And then on top of that, Charles married the sister of Louis XIII, who was Henrietta Maria. That's kind of controversial with that. And so a lot of the Stuarts, are related to the Bourbon dynasty, et cetera. And so, the Stuarts had converted to the Protestant faith and all that, but there was a lot of rumors that they were pro-Catholic, et cetera. So that was definitely a big controversy with that. So I think she's like basically the aunt of Louis XIV that you're looking at. Now, what happened was the Civil War broke out because of the fact that there was a conflict over how England should be governed. Basically, the Parliament wanted more power to be able to, basically pass all legislation, raise taxation, and things like that. They wanted a limited monarchy, but the king, Charles I, wanted absolutism. So that's kind of an issue with that. And so that's why the whole thing happened. It was really more about how to govern the state and not who the monarch actually is. That wasn't really the issue with that. So Parliament in 1628 passed this act, I guess, called the Petition of Right, which you may have heard of, which was supposed to limit the powers of King Charles, enable him not to be able to raise his own taxes or even pass his own edicts or laws and things like that. And the Petition of Right is considered to be one of several documents that are part of Britain's, constitutional monarchy that they have today. So it's kind of a very, very important document. Now, at first, I think he accepted it, but if you know about what happened was in 1629, he decided to abolish Parliament, and so that's what happened. He basically gets rid of Parliament, and so 1629 to 1640, he actually reigns by himself as an absolutist. So they kind of call that period of his reign the 11 years tyranny or the personal rule of Charles I. And so that's really the closest that the British really came to having an absolute monarchy, like they're doing in Europe, like say in France, etc. What ends up happening, because of the fact that he needs money to run the state and all that, in 1640, he's forced to recall Parliament. Now, there's a bunch of wars that break out, not just in Britain or whatever. Like they had this thing called the Bishops' War that broke out 1640, where the Scots were going to Presbyterianism. They didn't want episcopacy. They didn't want bishops. They wanted church elders like presbyters to run their state. And so they had this war break out between England and Scotland because of that. And then they also in Austria, they had, like in the Habsburg monarchy, they had the War of the Austrian Succession broke out as well. So they had I think they were back in Austria at the time. And so that was another issue that really caused it and all that. And so it led to him basically recalling Parliament. There were two parliaments that he called. There was one that was called the Short Parliament that was called in 1640, which only lasted a few weeks. And so they didn't, I guess, do what he wanted. So he closed them down. And then a few weeks later, he recalls Parliament again. And that's the so-called Long Parliament that's in power for like 20 years, 1640 to 1660. And so that's why it's called that. It's in power for a long time, et cetera. And that's the Parliament really that's going to oppose him, and it's going to lead to eventually the Civil War. Why does he have such struggle with Parliament? Well, if you know about England at the time, the Puritans were starting to take over the Anglican Church. These were basically Protestants that were in the Anglican Church that wanted to make the Church of England more Protestant, like a Reformed theology, like Calvinistic ideology, etc. They wanted to purify the Church of England of anything to do with Catholicism, any kind of practices or anything like that. And so there were a lot of members of Parliament that were Puritans, like Oliver Cromwell, we'll get to later as an example. And so he actually tries to have them arrested eventually. These members of Parliament are Puritans, and that's what causes the English Civil War to break out. So the Civil War breaks out in 1642. It's going to last about 8 or 9 years, 1642 to 1651. It's really not one civil war. It's actually several civil wars that occur throughout basically Britain. In fact, they call it different names. The War of the Three Kingdoms, I think, has been a common name they sometimes call in Britain. Some people call it the English Civil Wars or British Civil Wars are also used as well. I think in America we say English Civil War or something like that, or British Civil War as a whole. So now they had opposing sides in the war, which I'll talk about briefly. On one side, you had what they call the Cavaliers, which was a nickname for what they called the Royalists. The Royalists were basically those that supported King Charles and his army. Cavalier was more of a nickname saying that they're wealthy and rich because a lot of the nobility, wealthy landowners, they were the ones that really backed, of course, King Charles, of course, reign and all that. On the other side, you have the Roundheads. The Roundheads were also called the Parliamentarians side. They, of course, controlled mostly Parliament. And you can see they were more like middle-class type that were in there, small landowners, town-dwelling manufacturers, and Puritan clergy. Puritans, a lot of them were in it, of course. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan, himself was a member of Parliament, was involved in it, was one of their great generals. And their sons called Roundheads because of their helmets had kind of a round shape to it also as well. Over time, I'll get more into it later, but they had different generals that were part of it. The top two that were famous were Oliver Cromwell, who later was called, they called it Old Ironsides, is what it was called. And Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was called Black Tom, was actually the head of the actual New Model Army, which the New Model Army was the main army of the parliamentarian forces that took on Charles during the English Civil War and defeated him and all that. And it was founded in 1645. It was considered one of the first major English professional armies, especially one that fought all over Britain. It fought in England, fought in Scotland, it fought in Ireland, etc. And it was one of these first armies that also you can see they're used like more modernized muskets. You start seeing types of muskets that come out that are the, I guess, prototypes to what we call the flintlock musket, which will be later. I think I've got images showing some of the musketry that they had, but they had different muskets they used, I know, in the English Civil War, such as the matchlock, you may have heard of, which used like a fuse, basically, to light and fire the musket, which wasn't very good because it took a while for you to, when you pull the trigger, it took a while for it to go off. And then if it got wet, it went out. So you couldn't shoot it. And then they also have this thing called the dog lock or wheel lock musket, which they consider that to be the prototype musket that led later to the flintlock, which comes out later in the 1600s. And so muskets like that were used heavily on the battlefield, but they also used pikes as well. Pikes were also used too as well, which were used against cavalry and things like that. So the New Model Army was considered one of the most advanced armies in the world at the time. So at least in Britain it was, and they devastate King Charles's armies. They get practically almost wiped out overall. She's asking how do they decide how long they should reign? Well, usually monarchs, I guess it depends on when they die. Usually you reign till you die, about that with monarchs, or you get overthrown also as well, which I guess some did as well. So anyway, so that's it for today. My lecture one, of course, on the rise of the British Empire. Now later in the week, I'm going to, of course, have a part 2 lecture. I'll continue talking about the English Civil War and its aftermath. One of the things that's going to happen when we get up to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the British are going to go toward a constitutional monarchy. We'll see that happen overall. The rise of the prime minister, of course, will come in. I'll talk about some of the later dynasties. You got the House of Hanover, you've got House of Windsor, which is the current dynasty we've got now. So I'll kind of talk about that as well. So anyway, I'm kind of running out of time today. I know because we're past an hour and 15 minutes, but I'll kind of just remind y'all before I go about different assignments that are out there. Don't forget, I know don't forget the vocab. If you didn't turn that first vocab in, don't forget to get that to me. There's a second vocab that's out right now. I know. Conquistadors quiz, I think that's going to close tonight. So don't forget about that as well. And then, of course, the main things y'all should be concentrating right now is the first exam. I think it's due sometime next week. There's also a bonus quiz I've got out as well, which is on the scientific revolution of the Age of Enlightenment. So that's it for today. I don't know if I got a chance to answer all your questions and all that, but if you want to add a comment question later, you can go back to the video, of course, and do that and leave me comments so I can answer more easier. So y'all have a great rest of the week, and I'll see you, of course, later.